I need you all to imagine for a second that you are all now investors in Silicon Valley. I need you to be part of this theatrical experience with me. So if you're going to be investors in Silicon Valley, you're going to need the uniform. So I need all of you to put on your finest Patagonia. I need you to put on your best Allbirds. And above all, if you're going to be a VC in Silicon Valley, you need a vest. I don't know why, but you just have to wear a vest. It's very, very important. So as VCs, I'm now going to pitch you my best idea for a company. So someone comes up with their brand new iPhone. This is the iPhone XXXS. And our friend here, she needs to get somewhere really, really quickly. Really quickly. So she's going to call a helicopter. So we're going to build Uber for helicopters because this is a great idea. You didn't know that you need this, but now you do. So she could be calling this just from somewhere in Prague, maybe from the castle somewhere or from Charles Bridge or something like that. But maybe she needs to call her helicopter from the jungle. I don't know. Maybe she's in the jungle and she needs a helicopter. Maybe she's in the desert. She might need a helicopter there, right? These are very important things. So if she's going to be able to call these things from there, we're going to have to be very offline sensitive, right? So we're going to have service workers and things like that. And I mean, people that need helicopters have all sorts of phone needs, right? They might have the latest iPhone, like her XXXS. She might have an old version of Android. She might have a flip phone, right? People with flip phones need helicopters, right? That's a thing, so we're going to have to write a Java applet for that. And maybe even between playing games of Snake, she just needs to get that as well. So we're going to have to build our app for this as well. And most importantly, we need it for this platform. It's Windows Phone. It's the best one. So who's ready to fund my idea? I don't see many hands. Man, you must have unlimited money if you're going to fund that idea. Why would you not fund this idea? Well, one, it's a terrible idea. That's the first reason. But secondly, I was just focused on totally the wrong things, right? I was focused on, okay, I need to call a helicopter, and I also needed to work on super old phones. That makes zero sense. If someone's going to be ordering a helicopter, they're probably going to have an iPhone, right? Just kind of makes sense. They're probably not using Windows Phone. That's probably going to get me fired. Okay. I have a second idea for you. So we're going to build a new e-commerce experience. And we're going to build it specifically for India, right? But the crown jewel of this is only going to work on iPhone XS Max. Now, why is that a terrible idea? You going to fund that one? I don't see many hands for that one either. Because the iPhone has no penetration in India. So why would I start building an e-commerce experience only for one particular phone for India? So hopefully you're getting the idea here of I'm trying to mismatch product ideas with demographics. So this talk's called 10 kilobytes or bust, the delicate power of Webpack and Babel. I work for this tiny startup. You might have heard of it. We prefer Microsoft is actually how you pronounce it. Do a podcast on the side sometimes called Front End Happy Hour. It's mostly us just drinking and ranting about JavaScript. It's kind of fun. Sometimes you can find me on Front End Masters. These are some of the other places that I've worked. And I currently live in Seattle. I used to be from Utah, and I also lived in Torino for 2.5 years, so go Juventus. And I just show my puppy because this picture's adorable. Okay, moving on. So, this tweet bothers me. In fact, it's been a year since this was tweeted. It bothers me. I agree with the fundamental premise here, but I also just hate the way this is phrased. So let me read it for you. I only ask that frameworks put warnings on their products when they can't be accessible. E.g., this site is best viewed with a high net worth, right? Like, this is the most condescending, just terrible stuff that I've ever read. But I also agree with the kind of the premise here. But I mean, come on, like, no one sets out and goes to work and is like, I'm going to screw over people that don't have nice phones, right? I hope no one's doing that. Otherwise, you suck. Like, we're trying our best, right? Like, we go into work and we're just trying to ship product. And if our product demands that we ship for like low-end phones and stuff like that, we try and do that. But otherwise, we're just trying to ship features and fix bugs, right? You're trying to survive. Like, on a fundamental level, you are trying not to get fired, and your company's trying to stay afloat. So no one's setting out to do this. We're just not prioritizing these things sometimes. So what I kind of want to talk to you here about is that not every app needs to work on a 2G low-power phone. You need to know who you're selling to, right? As front-end developers, or as I imagine many of you are, or just developers in general, or designers, or product managers, or whatever you are, I hope you're looking at your analytics. If I ask you, who are your users, where are they coming from, what devices are they using, what operating systems are they using, how fast is their connection, these are questions you should probably be somewhat familiar with. And if not, you should go ask about that, because if you're not building your application for your users, who are you building it for? And the answer is probably yourself, right? You're probably building it to make it look nice on your phone and hope it works on other phones. Works on my machine. That being said, today we're going to be talking about 2G and low-power devices, because if you're building for that, it's going to probably look good on other devices as well. So I think it's useful to see these numbers up front. The entire time I've been in Prague, I've had great 4G LTE. It's gone super fast. So you are in the same boat I am in Seattle. So 2G, when I say 2G, I'm talking about more or less 14 kilobits per second. When I talk about 3G, going by the CDMA, which is the American way of doing it, it's 144 kilobits. 4G is about 100,000 kilobits per second, and gigabit fiber is about 1,000,000 kilobits per second. So I think it's useful to see how disparate those things are. So if you're working on your project and it's really fast and you're on gigabit, you're not seeing what it's like on 14, right? That's quite a bit slower. How many of you recognize this? Quite a few. This was my childhood. I spent a bunch of time on this thing, listening to its sweet song as it dialed into the internet. I can still hear it in my head, right? This thing was 56 kilobits per second. So I want you to imagine for a second, 2G is 14 kilobits per second. This thing that we were using, geez, 20 years ago, right? Something like that. It's like 4 times faster than that. Like that's a tough pill to swallow, right? Like I remember like leaving my computer on to download demos overnight, right? My parents would get furious at me because I'd run up the bill. But it's actually worse than that, right? It's worse than that because 2G is slower than that device, but it's worse now because websites are so much bigger than they used to be, right? Like everyone was on 56K back in the day, so they were designing websites to be loaded on that. But now websites are on, gigabit, and they're all being designed out of San Francisco and like these big Western cities like Prague, and we're designing for ourselves, and we're not necessarily designing for our users. That kind of sucks. So I'm going to start loading this for you, and we're going to watch LinkedIn.com load on 2G. Now I want everyone to put their phones away. If I see anyone with their phone, I'm going to throw something at you. I need you to watch this. I need you to suffer right now. Okay, we are 20 seconds into this, and nothing has showed up. I promise it's working. Like you can see it's spinning at the top, right? 28 seconds, and we finally get a loading spitter, right? Now, how many of you think any user would have stayed past this point? Okay, we are now 45 seconds in. We're starting to have like basically the first useful paint, right? This is a multi-billion-dollar company that Microsoft bought, I think, for $17 billion or something like that, and it's having a tough time loading at all. Now, to be fair, LinkedIn has other strategies for loading on low-power devices. I'm taking the desktop experience and loading on 2G. It's not totally apples to apples, but it's kind of ridiculous. We're 1.2 minutes in, and it's still not fully finished. Are we done yet? We're done yet. That took 1.3 minutes, okay? Now, I just want to contrast this experience for you. This is a different website called Tribo.com. It's a motel chain in India. And this is the exact same speed, okay? Are you ready for this? I'm going to press the button now. That's unbelievable, right? Yeah, that's worthy of applause. So they loaded the entire website in 12 seconds, but the first useful paint was less than a second on 2G, right? And the techniques they use on this are not terribly difficult. Adi Asmani of Google has an amazing write-up on how they did it, and you absolutely should read it. So if this is a competition, then San Francisco's getting its peach kicked in the worst way. So hopefully at this point you're sitting there and it's like, I feel bad, right? I want you to feel bad. I've been trying to shame you since I got up on the stage. So this is how I feel most of the time when I'm trying to I know something needs to be done, but I don't know what to do. Just feel like I'm floating out in space, right? This dog is my spirit animal. So I'm going to give you a bunch of tips on things you can do. Some of them will be very easy for you to accomplish, things that you should go do right now. And some of the things are going to be like you should change your entire stack, right? So some of them are not necessarily as easy, but you can consider maybe when you're starting your next project. So the first thing you should consider is question your framework, right? If you choose Angular, which Angular is a fantastic framework, I know some of the core team members and they're just doing amazing things with the technology, but if you choose Angular today, using the current compiler, you're out of the gate like 62 kilobits, right? Which means that without having written any app code or importing any other modules, you're in 2 seconds. 2 seconds of loading just your framework. That sucks, right? That sucks a little bit. React, which is my tool of choice, even then, you're still in a second, right? Vue, 0.7 seconds. And so when you start getting into things like Inferno and Preact and Svelte and some of these other more focused frameworks, then you can start getting into these 0.1 seconds, right? And that's acceptable. So that's something you might think about if you're targeting those kind of users. Babel preset env. You should upgrade to Babel 7 when that's convenient for you. And you should specifically upgrade to preset env. Babel preset ES 2015 is deprecated. You should not be using that anymore. It's yelling at you in your console if you are still using it. But if you are, this is something you should definitely go change. And you can just go change to preset env, and it should just work the same way. Reason being here is preset env. As we get newer and newer browsers, we'll compile less and less of your app. And Babel preset ES 2015 will forever transpile all of your app into ES5, which is not necessarily going to match your demographics. This is an advanced technique. It's Christopher Baxter, again from Google, who I used to work with at Netflix and LinkedIn. Wrote some blog posts about how you can do this. You can basically transpile your app twice, once for new browsers and once for old browsers, and then using the script type equals module target different browsers, because only newer browsers will download the type equals module. There's some more nuance to it. You should definitely read the blog post on it. Tree shaking. It's an interesting one. So this particular bit of code up here, once you compile it and not gzip it, is 73.3 kilobytes of code, which is unbelievable, right? 2 effective lines of code, and I yielded 73.3 kilobytes of data. Why? Because this is loading all of Lodash for one call, and that kind of sucks. Who in here thinks that they've used every method in Lodash? Nope. Good. No one's lying. No one, right? There's like 200 methods, and you use like 3 of them, and then you don't use the other ones, right? Yet we all load it in our application. So let's talk about how you can actually load less of it. So the important part that you want to see here is modules false there, right? Oops. Modules false. That's telling Babel to not transpile the modules, to let Webpack or whatever bundler you're using compile it. Because at that point, then it can use the new ES6 modules, ESM modules, which is redundant, the new ES modules to do tree shaking, which will do live code inclusion, right? Tree shaking is synonymous with live code inclusion. Browser's last 2 versions, this is an anti-pattern. You should not be doing this anymore. The reason being is this will do last 2 versions of all browsers, including dead browsers. So you'll forever be doing basically what I was telling you before. You'll be transpiling all of your code for every browser. So this is what you should be doing now, 0.25% and not dead. Modules false, that's what I was talking about before. So going back to our original example here, if you just do that and allow tree shaking to happen, which is what low-dash-es is doing, then we're able to get 11.1 kilobytes. So you can visualize that this is the one that I just showed you, and this is the first one, right? So you can see this is not loading very many modules. This is loading everything in Lodash. So definitely something you should be doing. Tree shaking is no silver bullet, which I thought that was very clever. Apparently no one thinks I'm funny. Thank you. That was the best pity clap I ever got. If you're tree shaking something like, React, right? React doesn't have any dead code to eliminate, or at least has very little dead code to eliminate. So you're not really doing very much, right? Dead code elimination, or rather live code inclusion, is much more useful for things like Lodash and jQuery, where you're not using everything. Use built-ins. This is another feature of Babel. So the basic idea here is use built-ins usage. This is new with Babel 7, I believe. It will only import the polyfills that you need at the time, right? So if it detects that your environment doesn't support promises, it'll wait for you to actually use promises before importing the polyfill for it, which is really great. Loose mode, this one's been around for a long time, but just to kind of show you here, this is the polyfill for classes on the left, and the one on the right is the polyfill for classes in loose mode. The idea behind loose mode is that something like classes has a lot of edge cases, and most time you're not doing crazy stuff that will reach those edge cases. So you're safe to kind of just assume that you're going to use it in the same way, and that's what loose mode is. I've been using loose mode for maybe, I don't know, how long has it been called Babel? For a couple years anyway, and I've never had any problem with it, so I would suggest most of you at least try switching to loose mode and see if it works for you. Please build using nodev equals production. This is literally free performance. Slack famously shipped the development version of React for years, right? And it's slower because it has all the debug code, and it's bigger. It's just a bad thing. So you should definitely be building your application with nodev equals production. Code splitting. So the name of the talk is 10 kilobytes or bust. The only way that you're going to be able to do that is by doing code splitting. The idea behind code splitting is that you defer loading important modules that are not needed for the first paint until after the first paint. So it's kind of a misnomer. Your app will still be bigger than 10 kilobytes, but your initial payload, you should be aiming for as low as possible. You should be identifying the key modules, the key code that you need to be able to get there. Source maps, do not ship source maps inline in your production code. I wish I didn't have to say that, but I've seen it, right? If you ship source maps inline in your production code, it will quadruple at least the size of your production bundle. So please make sure that you're not doing that. Scope hoisting, this was something that Rollup kind of brought to the scene for the front-end community, and then a bunch of the other bundlers have adopted it. The basic gist here is line 4 on the left. That Webpack require method right there, it's not free. In fact, it's quite expensive. Whereas you can see on the right there, that function helper right there, it gets actually inlined right there, and you get a bunch of performances. So it'll actually inline those smaller functions right there, so it's within the same scope. It's much, much faster. You'll get a bunch of performance wins that way at runtime. Image skeletons. So don't get me wrong, 10 kilobytes of JavaScript is not the same as 10 kilobytes of images. Images are far cheaper in the sense that they just have to be parsed and displayed, whereas JavaScript has to be like executed and tokenized and all that kind of stuff. So images are not the same. So eliminating 10 kilobytes of JavaScript is far better than images. But at the same time, images are really cheap to optimize. And one of my favorite methods is using image skeletons, which is loading like the bare minimum amount of images that you need so that your user can use your interface. And then after the initial paint, going through and loading the actual full image. So you can see here, these are just using SVGs to approximate what the images are, and these SVGs are like bytes instead of kilobytes or megabytes. So this is one method using SVGs. This one's really cool because like someone went through and actually designed the outlines, and then you load the image on top of it. It's kind of a cool effect. This is actually one of my favorite ones. It's really easy to animate SVGs, and so you can actually animate it together and then load the image behind it while it's animating. It's kind of another cool effect. Or you can use one of these others, a little bit easier options. Blur up is one that famously Facebook has done, solid color placeholders, or just having a box there. See, this was just an example project that I pulled down. I was able to cut out like 2 or 3 megabytes of just bundle sized by taking out the images. This was including all of its images in the bundles. So this is just kind of a summary of how you can get there. I don't really have time to get into it, but there's some tips into the slide deck of how you can do this with functions as well and kind of optimize your backend for it as well. I used Microsoft Azure for the examples, but you could do these things just as easily with Lambdas or anything like that. One of my favorite ones here, but your basic gist is that you want to reduce your time to first byte. There's something called the Server Timings API, where you can actually ship what your backend is doing to the Chrome DevTools, and the DevTools are actually able to read that. So you can actually see here, I can see how long MySQL is taking, and so you can go and yell at your backend devs to, fix their stuff. And I always like blaming things on other people. Compress your responses. I worked at a company that will remain nameless that was not compressing any of their API responses, and like, that's just free web performance. Like that's just like, please go make sure that all of your API responses are getting gzipped on the way down. Check out Brotli. That's another form of compression that's not gzip. LinkedIn tried this and it was able to reduce P90 performance, which is basically like 90% of the 90th percentile of your users, right? And even saw some wins in India with it. And the support for Brotli is actually quite good now. So I think this was like, yeah, it was 70% of global users are using devices that support Brotli. So the trade-off for Brotli is that it's much slower to do. So if I'm compressing like my static assets using Brotli, it takes longer than gzip, but usually that's an okay trade-off for you to make. So just keep that in mind. Cold start is always a problem for all functions as a service or serverless kind of stuff. So we have something called Azure Function Pack, which will actually do all the node module resolution stuff for you. So kind of just to wrap up here, you have to know your audience. You have to know who you're building for, right? If I'm building for Uber for helicopters, right, I don't need to work on Snake phones or Windows Phone, right? Like I can design my application for my users that are using it. But by the same token, we kind of like the web is for everyone. It's not just for people with fast computers and fast internet connections and people that can afford to be at these conferences like me, right? It's for everyone. So it's our ethical duty as web developers to make sure that we're reaching everyone that we can. Accessibility is a part of that. Web performance is part of that. So just kind of keep that in mind while you're building these sorts of things. So thank you.
Let's give it up for Brian. Brian, you ready for some questions?
Yeah, let's do it.
Great. First one. What would be the loading time of LinkedIn's mobile web page on 2G, though? Because you've compared desktop to mobile for some reason.
Yeah, it's because I'm a jerk. I did it for effect, because I wanted to show you how bad it can really be. And I picked on LinkedIn because I worked there, and so I was part of the problem. So you can do what's called adaptive design. So you can actually ship like different HTML and CSS. You can do all sorts of deferment, but specifically LinkedIn has like a Android Lite application that's really small and designed for low bandwidth networks. So to be fair to LinkedIn, they do an okay job.
Brutally honest, I like
yeah.
it. All right, what about the impact of user tracking and other analytics scripts, ads, etc.?
That stuff's really tough because a lot of those vendors want to be like loaded up front, and I always push back. I always try and defer it to like, so it's one of the last things I do. You will definitely drop pieces of analytics if you defer it to the end and not do it in the head, but I think the web performance is worth it. So I would definitely push against your data science team or your marketing team or whoever is like, you can load Tag Manager later. It's going to be okay.
All right, why optimize for people with slow connectivity, but not for ones with old devices? Android 4.0, Windows XP, for example.
It's a good question. It comes down to your demographic. Like, I used to work at a company that the state of Utah was one of our biggest users of our application, and the state of Utah only has Windows XP, so we had to work on Internet Explorer 6. That was just a big part of it, right? But when I worked at Netflix, we didn't support IE6, that's why we didn't really look at Windows XP. So it depends on who your users are, and that's something you should be looking into.
Okay, what tips would you recommend for improving first paint time?
Reducing time to first byte, that's always kind of the easiest one, right? Deferring all of your unnecessary JavaScript until later, inlining critical CSS, those are all things that are going to help with your first paint, for sure.
Mm-hmm. If the LinkedIn team leveraged the suggestions you made, would they see a significant boost in load times? Or can you explain what they are doing wrong?
I don't want to throw my old colleagues under the bus.
Do it! I'm kidding. Anyone here from LinkedIn? Just didn't happen.
They're doing some pretty amazing stuff with Glimmer and like Glimmer 2.0 that I think will help a lot. I think they've done some pretty crazy things with their Ember that it's on the engineering side, it's not necessarily on the Ember side, so they're going to have to resolve some of those issues, and it's just they have a lot of JavaScript and a lot of CSS, and they're just going to have to reduce those things down to smaller sizes. They have hard problems going on right now, for sure.
All right, Dan would like to know, how can we accomplish code splitting?
That's another 25-minute talk right there. But I think the best answer is that you have to use what's called dynamic import, or the old way of doing it would be require.ensure. And most bundlers are smart enough to say, like, oh, you're using dynamic import here. This is a code splitting point. And then it can split that bundle out. Beyond that, you probably should just read a blog. There's lots of blog posts on that kind of stuff. So.
We had some problems with 3 shaking.
3 shaking.
3 shaking doesn't work with all NPM module. True.
It doesn't work with all NPM modules. I mean, I believe you. It should work with most NPM modules. The only thing I could see you running into is if you're like polluting global namespace, which hopefully most of your modules aren't doing that kind of stuff. But if that could be a problem, but for the most part, it should work with almost anything.
Please, Brian, what's the name of your puppy?
Luna. Her name's Luna. She's a cutie.
And final question, what do you think of non-JSON marshalling like protobuf?
I don't know enough to talk about it. But I'm happy to have an offline conversation about it once I look at what it actually is. I have no idea what it is.
All right. Let's put our hands together for Brian.